Thank you very much. So members of our wider Lutheran community, friends of Lutheran Archives, staff and students, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for the 2016 Fritzsche Oration. This year the oration is being recorded and live streamed, enabling those around Australia who are unable to physically attend the opportunity to join us this evening. Hi, Mum. It will also mean that a copy of the oration will be available for historic reference in years to come. The Fritzsche Oration is an annual event sponsored jointly by the Committee of Lutheran Archives and our research centre here at the college, the Australian Lutheran Institute for Ethics, Theology and Ethics, ALITE. We'll begin this evening with a brief word from Jeanette Lange, Acting Director of Lutheran Archives, who will provide some background for you on Fritzsche and how the oration came about. The ALITE Director, Dr Stephen Holcren, will then say a few words, and later in the evening you will hear briefly from the Chair of the Committee of Lutheran Archives, Everard Lesky. So I now invite Jeanette to come forward.
Welcome everyone tonight to our 5th annual Fritzsche Oration. Tonight's Fritzsche Oration will be given by Dr Vic Pfitzner and is entitled Professorial Personalities, Luther Seminary's Early Years. Now he is well placed to provide recollections on the personalities associated with the beginnings of the new United Luther Seminary, formed in 1968, having been an inaugural lecturer and serving in that capacity until 2004, and also as principal from 1989 to 1997. Now, it might seem strange that in this year of the celebration of 50 years of LCA, or 50th anniversary of Union, as some would say, we should focus on Luther Seminary, which was dedicated and opened in March 1968. But nothing could be further from the truth. Luther Seminary was the official LCA Thanksgiving project for Union. As Reverend E.W. Weebush wrote, this new seminary was to be a real thank offering for Lutheran Union. They saw in this institution the fulfilment of prayers over many long years. They realised that nothing would cement the union of the Lutheran churches of this land more than one seminary. And so, some 120 years after division, future pastors of the church, coming from separate synods, would once again worship, study and live together. Which of course leads us in turn to the first Lutheran seminary in this country and the man who established it, the pastor after whom this oration is named. Gotthard Daniel Fritzsche, the second Lutheran pastor in Australia, answered Pastor Carville's repeated requests for old Lutheran pastors to migrate to Australia. After their arrival in 1838, Carville and his parishioners had been immediately concerned with the need for more pastors and the need to establish an institution to train Lutheran pastors and teachers here in Australia. There were even hopes of establishing a mission institute to send missionaries to India. Understandably, the workload for this was too great for one pastor to manage on his own. And so, at the first synodical convention held in May 1839, the resolution was made to invite Pastor Fritzsche and his congregation to migrate to Australia. Fritzsche was a reputed theologian. He was boldly old Lutheran, and he was known to the Australian Lutherans. He had for a number of years served as a school teacher in Posen prior to his ordination, and so he was the perfect candidate to assist Carville. From 1835, Fritzsche had travelled around Prussia holding clandestine services for old Lutherans, constantly evading imprisonment and putting his fragile health at risk. He believed that he should not emigrate for the sake of his faith, but should instead endure the persecution in Prussia and continue to minister to his flock of old Lutherans. However, by 1840, his parishioners were pushing for emigration, and Fritzsche agreed to accompany them, arriving in Adelaide in 1841. In 1842, Fritzsche established the much-anticipated Seminary and Teacher Training Institute in Lobethal. Fritzsche and his wife initially opened their own home to the students who lived with them whilst they studied. and later the students were to live with members of the congregation. The first group of students consisted of 6 men. Conditions were challenging, as the students had to accompany Fritzsche as he journeyed between congregations, reciting lessons and conjugating verbs along the way. They would camp out, which was manageable in summer months, but less than ideal during winter and periods of rain, a bit like today. 3 years later, a 2-roomed hut was built, which was both the study and dormitory for Fritzsche's Lobethal College. Graduates of the college included Oster, Strempel, Hensel, Auricht and teacher Müller, who all became pivotal church leaders and ministers, laying the foundation for the church we have today. Lutherans have a strong history of education, of learning and of theology, and so it is apt that the Committee of Lutheran Archives and Elite have named their annual oration in honour of Fritzsche, the founding educator of Lutheran theologians and teachers in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. And now I'd invite Dr. Stephen Holkren, the Director of Elite, to come forward.
Thank you. And it is a pleasure for me to be able to welcome you as well tonight on behalf of Elite. I'll just want to say a little bit about Elite and what we do and how this event fits into it. Elite has a number of aims, but just to highlight 2 or 3 of them. First is to initiate and support research projects based in Lutheran theology and ethics, and to promote, in general, the research culture here at Australian Lutheran College. And one of the ways we do that, more specifically ways we do that, is partnering with LCA institutions. So, for example, we have had partnerships with Lutheran Education Australia. We had a large 2-year project with them. Just recently, we've completed a major study on the state of the ordained ministry in the LCA, and that major report is done and will be released soon. We're working on a popular report for broader consumption. We're also about to undertake a study of the call process in the LCA. And many of these requests, of course, come from at the request of LCA agencies, Conference of Bishops, etc. Among other things we do is to hold occasionally academic conferences, and you may well know that we just had a major conference in Melbourne, end of June, early July, on the theology of Martin Luther, as a way of commemorating the lead up to the 500th anniversary of the Reformation in 2017. A very successful event. We had 14 speakers, 7 international, 7 from Australia, New Zealand, and 175 registrations, so we're very pleased with that. But we hope that amidst all this, that the work that Elite does will be of relevance and interest to the church and community, and so we, as part of that, we're happy to co-sponsor the Fritzsche Oration. We view the Fritzsche Oration as another kind of research. Of course, has a bit of a popular aspect to it as well, but nonetheless, research into the LCA's history, keeping that alive for us and in our consciousness, and dealing with it, and helping us to understand our history better and to understand, therefore, ourselves better. So I thank Dr. Pfitzner for his work and for presenting tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. As you're well aware, tonight's oration is being presented by ALC's Emeritus Lecturer, the Rev Dr Vic Pfitzner, otherwise known simply, well, I've said that already, Vic. I should have said Victor Pfitzner, simply known as Vic. Vic was born in Pinaroo on the 14th of October 1937. He spent his formative years at Loxton, where his father, Carl Pfitzner, was pastor. The kind and loving example of his parents, Carl and Elvira, combined with a powerful impression left by visiting missionaries from Papua New Guinea, instilled in Vic the sense that God was calling him to the public ministry. Following his ordination in January 1961, Vic undertook doctoral studies in Münster, Germany. Knowing of his prowess as an Australian rules footballer, his doctoral supervisor, Karl-Henrik Regensdorf, suggested that Paul's use of athletic terminology in clarifying his struggle for the gospel would make a good topic for a thesis. After a short period of parish ministry in Queensland, Vic was called in 1967 to lecture at Concordia Seminary in Highgate, South Australia. In 1968, when Luther Seminary was established, he joined the founding faculty as lecturer in New Testament theology at the relatively young age of 31. He went on to serve as principal of the seminary from 1989 until 1997 and retired from teaching in 2004. Vic's literary output has covered a wide range of topics, including biblical narrative and rhetoric, hermeneutics, Christian spirituality, the charismatic movement, ecumenical dialogue, the role of women in the church, justice and human rights, and the church's ministry of care. Vic has also taken the time to write popular commentaries and Bible survey courses for use in congregational settings. His international reputation led to guest lectureships in the USA, Yugoslavia, and Papua New Guinea, and nearer to home at St Francis Xavier Seminary, Adelaide College of Divinity, and the Catholic Education Service. First and foremost, Vic is a man of the church, an intentionally Lutheran theologian. Who could recount the papers he has written for the Commission on Theology and Interchurch Relations? Who could tell how many difficult issues he has been able to help the church work through by applying the counsel of the Bible and the wisdom of the church to the matter under review, while showing profound respect for people holding opposing views? After the consolidation of the union between the LCA's two predecessor churches, Vic presided over a commission whose members were able to debate matters openly and candidly as brothers and sisters within the family, especially when confronting the difficult question of the ordination of women. Vic himself would be the last person to comment, but few would disagree that he succeeded in generating healthy debate and harmony within the CTICR as its chair, before stepping down after the 2003 Synod. That legacy remains in place to this day. So, without further ado, I now invite Vic forward to present to you the Fritzsche Oration for 2016, entitled Professorial Personalities, Luther Seminary's Early Years.
Very good evening to you all. Oration. The word oration I find extremely daunting. Do you want to know what the Oxford Dictionary says about oration? A formal address or harangue, a discourse of a ceremonial kind. None of that applies to what you're about to hear. You'll be glad of that. The goal of oratory certainly is to inform and persuade. I'm just an old preacher and teacher. I'm not an orator. Tonight all you get is a talk. All you get is not a discourse but a chat in the form of recollections about events and especially people associated with the beginning of what was once Luther Seminary. And this room was the lecture theatre with banked seats going right up to the top of the window behind me. Why recall Hebert, HAMANN, Zasser, and other worthies of the first teaching staff? In a few years, all who participated in those almost halcyon years will not be about to tell the story, at least from first-hand experience, and that includes me. My qualifications for telling my version of the story is that I was one of the first 7 to be called to teach in '68. And I had the dubious honour of being appointed minute secretary for faculty meetings. I had no choice in the matter. At 30 years of age, I was the junior and did as I was told. So unlike some colleagues who occasionally lapsed into sleepy inattention during boring business, I had to stay awake for nearly 20 years at all of the faculty meetings. Those minutes reflect something of the seminary, and other things of those early years have been recorded by Dr. John Koch in the 92-93 yearbook, and I've written also an article for the Lutheran Archives. But I'm here tonight more interested in the humanity of those years, the human people, the unique human characters that were on the teaching staff, or as we used to say in those days, the faculty. They deserve to be remembered, to be recorded, a place in the common memory of the LCA. They were more than containers, conduits, or creators of theological thought, and if I recall something incorrectly or record anything inappropriately, I take comfort in the thought that I am now too old to be sued or to be excommunicated. Some of you will find next to nothing that is new in what I am presenting, but perhaps what I say will revive pleasant memories. The birth of Luther Seminary was preceded by a brief period of gestation. Conception took place as soon as the engaged couple, ELCA and UELCA, you work out which is male and female, were married in 1966. Some family planning went beforehand. Some planning in terms of facilities and programs preceded the birth. The need for accommodation led to building plans, church-wide appeals for finances. Lecturers of both Concordia and Emmanuel held a series of meetings to establish a new academic program. The teaching staff of the new school included Drs. Siegfried Paul Hebert, Hermann Sasser, Johannes Theodor Erich Renner, who is here with us, Pastor Adolf Lowe from Emmanuel, those four from Emmanuel, and Dr. Henry Paul Harmon, Paul David Powell, and myself. A rather Pauline group. They soon became known to students, I think, as Doc, Henry, Zus, Jackie, Paul, AJ, and Vic. At least, I think that's what they called us most of the time. Behind our backs, another matter. The choice of these seven had been made easier by the retirement of Concordia's Dr. Fred Blaise and Dr. Elvin Janetsky's call to be principal of the new Lutheran Teachers College. Preparatory meetings between the two faculties, or the people who were to be on the new faculty, proceeded very smoothly, and why not? All involved were well known to each other, some as participants in intersynodical discussions prior to union. Some were members of the rather exclusive Adelaide Theological Circle, and Drs. Renner and Harmon had together served as spiritual guides to the Lutheran Student Fellowship at Adelaide University. I'm not sure where I belonged in terms of representation, somewhere in the middle, I imagine. I was a graduate of Emmanuel Seminary, but had 2 years prior to union crossed synodical borders to accept a call to teach at Concordia. It was probably easier for the teaching staff to work together harmoniously from the outset than it was for the students to shed the old Concordia versus Emmanuel rivalry. However, there were among the first 94 students some pretty strong characters that helped to weld together two traditions and allegiances. They included future church president Mike Zemler among us tonight, Noel Noack, David Christian, Ray Schultz, Rob Voigt, future mission director and general secretary Wayne Swick, future lecturers John Kleinig, Rick Strelin, Dean Swick, Mike Hasselt, Peter Lockwood, Greg Lockwood, and of course Malcolm Batch. Planning a new academic program in 66 to 67 did not proceed without some pretty hefty, robust debate. Each school had its own traditions. There had to be compromises. Haybart, for example, argued for the continuation of the Emmanuel requirement since 1952 of a final year thesis. HAMANN, and I think he was right, argued that a thesis belonged to postgraduate studies. A compromise determined that only new students at Luther would have to submit a thesis. So, between 1972 and 87, when the BTH was accredited, 160 students submitted a thesis. I suspect that they may still be resting peacefully in the rare book section of the library. The theses, not the students. And I think most of them deserve to be left undisturbed. Concordia had required 2 years of classical pre-seminary studies, so a stringent regime of Hebrew, Greek, Latin and German was devised. Thus, with a year of vicarage, a 6-year course came into being, even 7 years for a few years. A few comments on the optimism of those times is in place. At the opening of the seminary and the installation of lecturers on March the 3rd, 1968, a huge crowd spilled out from the sanctuary set up in the walkway of Grosvenor Hall, reaching across the sacred lawn to the wall along Ward Street. I think we have some vision of that later from the archives. The preacher on the occasion was Vice President Harold Caney, who took as his text Proverbs 22:28. Remove not the ancient landmarks which thy fathers have set. What ensued was a classic example of allegory on a piece of land theology, as the preacher told us that it behoved the church, teachers and students not to move the landmarks of confessional Lutheranism. Rather, it behoved us to remain true to our conservative heritage. Good sentiment, you can imagine. I think that one of his favourite words was behove. There was a lot of behoving. We lecturers were sitting behind the public dignitaries invited for the event, including the Lord Mayor, Alderman Bridgeland, and the Premier Don Dunstan, who was still an Anglican, by the way, at that stage, having not yet renounced the faith. I recall Dunstan occasionally shaking his head during the sermon, and the pomp and ceremony that included stirring renditions by the Tanunda Band, a choir of 40 voices, fanfares for 3 trumpets composed by the organist of St. Peter's Cathedral, Jack Peters. After the ceremony, one of our colleagues, David Pyle, an ardent Labour man, said to Premier Dunstan, "You wouldn't get many votes from this mob." If I remember rightly, Dunstan merely raised his eyebrows in agreement. Did he perhaps spot an element of Lutheran triumphalism on that inaugural day? Well, perhaps triumphalism is too strong a word, but there was certainly optimism in the air. Resolution 62 of the Constituting Convention of the LCA set the optimum number of students at the new seminary at approximately 200. Would you believe it? 200. Record enrolments at the two seminaries no doubt contributed to such unrealistic expectations. Plus, of course, as we have heard, Thanksgiving euphoria over church union. The reality is that total enrolment of full-time ministry students only twice passed the 100 mark, and that was in 1980, 1981. And the figure was reached then because the course for ordained ministry was 7 years long. Grosvenor Hall was built to house 90 students, but long-term planning envisaged yet another student home of equal proportions. No one at that stage foresaw that the days of young students coming directly to seminary from church colleges would cease to be the normal thing. That normal would, within about 3 decades, normal would be mature age, married, second or even third career students. It took a mere 2 decades before Grosvenor Hall became a home of for university boarders rather than theologues. These days, I believe it is rather inadequate student housing. Now to the task in hand, to capture the living history and theological contribution of faculty members. For the purpose of this chat, those years cover 1968 to 1977, in other words, the first decade. That saw 11 teachers. And the emphasis will be on living history and some stories, perhaps, rather than an analysis of theological contribution. I recall our first principal, Dr. Siegfried Hebart, with affection and admiration. He had been my teacher and principal during student days here at Emmanuel, and suddenly I was colleague of a man whom I held in awe. Doc was heir to a long tradition of German language and culture, but was almost British in his diction and sense of order and decorum. As the Australian-born and educated son of Pastor Theodor Hebart, author of the History of the UELCA, he knew the church very well, despite having completed his doctorate at Erlangen University, with a thesis on the ecclesiology of the great Wilhelm Löher of Neuendettelsau, the grand-uncle of Director Löher, after whom the library is named. Hebart's return from postgraduate studies in Germany in the late 1930s after the rise of National Socialism had set some tongues wagging in the UELCA. He brought with him a wife who was a divorcee, an ex-Roman Catholic, and who had Jewish blood. Dr. Renner recently drew to my attention a document in our Lutheran archives, a circular dated the 3rd of April 1939, written by the president of the UELCA, Dr. J.J. Stolz, concerns the young Dr. Hebart, recently returned from Germany to teach at Emmanuel College. Stolz vehemently defends the Hebarts against false rumour and innuendo about a supposedly irregular marriage. Gossip being given some credibility in church circles, apparently. The circular is a passionate defence of the Hebarts, of their blamelessness in marrying, and an equally passionate appeal for slander and rumour-mongering to cease. Interesting to me personally is that present at that meeting on March the 30th, that cleared the Hebarts of any wrongdoing were my Pfitzner grandfather and his brother-in-law, my worst grand-uncle, W-U-R-S-T. Why mention this episode 30 years before Luther Seminary came into being? Why mention it? Because one cannot think of Doc as ever being anything but, as we would say in German, ein gediegener Mensch, a gentleman of impeccable character. Generations of students at Emmanuel and Luther Seminary remember him as one who is proper in every sense of the word, who loved order, even a bit of pomp and ceremony. Order included the fact that the whole community ate lunch together in the refectory, with lecturers being assigned to the head of each table on a rostered basis so that we would speak to the students, or that the students would learn to speak to us. Pomp included the fact that we began to wear, as Henry HAMANN called it, academic haberdashery, hoods and gowns. A practice initiated by our principal but discontinued after his retirement was the posting of all exam results in the yard outside. I think a lot of students were very relieved when that practice was discontinued. Though Doc was the soul of propriety and tact, he possessed a marvellous sense of humour. This allowed him to react to student pranks with leniency and to be elastic in the maintenance of good order. Brother David Powell, in those days we were all brothers. It's a good heritage of pietism. Brother David Powell had the habit of commenting on all matters discussed during faculty meeting, no matter who was talking. That he did so sotto voce did not diminish the fact that his constant chattering could be rather annoying, especially to our principal in the chair. On one occasion, Doc good-naturedly appealed to Powell to cease his endless commentary on anything and everything. Brother Powell, can we please have some order? Compliance did not last long, and the chattering soon resumed. To which Doc responded with more urgency, "Brother Pa, please, can you not talk over other people during the meeting?" After a period of silence, the inevitable happened. The commentary from Pa continued, to which Dr Hobart said from the chair, "Pa, shut up." A slight smile accompanied the authoritarian command and everyone laughed. Tension was released. Dr Hobart is still widely remembered outside the Lutheran Church as a tutor in German at the University of Adelaide, as a speaker on ABC religious programs, and as an ecumenist. But it is his contribution to the theology of the Lutheran Church in Australia and to Lutheran theological education that will last longest in the memories of those who knew him. Theologically, I think we could describe him as a man of the middle path, confessional, yet ecumenically committed, conservative, yet a proponent of academic freedom and open inquiry. In the much discussed area of Scripture, he strongly promoted the material principle as determinative of inspiration, canonicity, and authority. In other words, Christology was the starting point. It was the heart of his theological thinking and preaching. That he actually published little is because he gave so much of his time to meetings, dialogues, lectures, informal talks, to administration, and together with his wife to cataloguing a rather disorganised collection of books and turning it into a functioning library. Finally, he will be remembered as a lecturer who never managed to complete his dogmatics course. The prolegomena, the discussion of the beginnings, never got to eschatology, the discussion of the ending of things. When Dr Hobart retired in 1979, he had been principal of a theological college for, believe it or not, 45 years. A record that never will be surpassed, surely, in terms of longevity. He died in November 1990, aged 81, and I was honoured to be asked by the family to preach at his funeral at St Stephen's, Wakefield Street. I remember Dr Henry Paul HAMANN with respect and affection for a number of reasons, even though I argued with him on some occasions. I think he has never been given enough credit for the role he played at the last ELCA General Convention in persuading a small group of opposing pastors to join the Union of 1966. He was quite instrumental also in intersynodical discussions. I think it's from Dr Renner that I've got the story that as Harmon Sr. was one day expounding on the differences between ELCA and UELCA, Henry stood up and said with quiet affection for his dad, "Dad, it's not like that anymore. It's not like that anymore." Though Henry had been principal of Concordia Seminary at Union, he had to step down to become vice principal at Luther Seminary, and he did so graciously. Third point, why I honour Henry. Under his leadership as principal from 1980 to 1985, the teaching staff became an administrative team, with Henry trusting each person to get on with their designated task with a minimum of oversight. I remember him saying to me, "Do your job and I'll talk to you only when you get in a mess." He himself was an able administrator, having served as academic dean while vice principal. In addition, he set a very high standard as first editor in the production of the faculty's periodical that still flourishes under the leadership of Dr. Peter Lockwood, the Lutheran Theological Journal. Henry was a voluminous writer, books, articles, a sharp-eyed reviewer and commentator on current theological issues. His judgments could be acerbic, but they were always well considered, never ever personal. Fourthly, Henry's conservative theological position as I've already hinted, never led to personal attacks on those with whom he disagreed, or to demanding that students simply accept answers without thinking for themselves. Fifthly, I recall Henry's soft heart that showed itself quite often when making decisions about delinquent students. Let's give him another chance, was Henry's frequent judgment. Despite his somewhat gruff exterior, Henry was, in my experience, a softie inside. Sixthly, here, this is rather personal, Henry was the person mainly responsible for my call in 1966 to be a lecturer at Concordia Seminary following the death of Professor Altus. That was a year before Union. Seventhly, reaching the number of perfection, Henry and his wife Erica were perfect hosts at the occasional faculty potluck dinner held in each other's homes. He was a veritable bon vivant whose musical and literary tastes were refined and who knew his wines and liqueurs. The most important thing in life, isn't it? Erica, in turn, was a wonderful cook. Less popular, especially among seminary wives, my late wife included, was Henry Harmann's dancing that tended to resemble the lively movements of square dancing that Henry championed in Lutheran circles when proper dancing was still a serious sin. Dr. Henry Harmann was a passionate Lutheran who once asserted, "Either I'm a Lutheran or I'm nothing." Not a Christian of any shade, he meant. At best, he might consider being an Epicurean. He naturally represented the heritage of American conservative Lutheranism, having gained his doctorate at Concordia, St. Louis. Honesty and forthrightness characterized his manner of speaking. He spoke without fear or favor. Yet he was no mere repristinator, no mere repeater of past dogmatic formulae. There's an irony in the fact that such a conservative theologian as Henry Harmann was occasionally under attack from people in his own church because he dared to reformulate doctrine, to think outside the square, to reject an unbiblical fundamentalism and the literalist reading of Scripture, as in the case of the long-running debates over the interpretation of the creation accounts in the book of Genesis. There's an even sadder irony in the fact that an early decision of Henry Harmann himself would eventually return to bite him. He had blocked Siegfried Havard from part-time lecturing on his retirement. And when Henry himself retired in 1985, he was denied the privilege of part-time teaching, and that hit him hard. So he went off to the States to lecture at Fort Wayne, a move that sadly came to an end when he was found to be suffering from pancreatic cancer, and the flight back home to Australia was difficult. The end came quickly. He died in December 1988, aged 79, my age. By far the best known lecturer in the early years of Luther Seminary was Dr. Hermann Sasser, a man of international reputation as a redoubtable proponent of confessional Lutheran theology and a steadfast opponent of Hitler's National Socialism. The UELCA scored a major coup when Sasser accepted the call to leave his post as Professor of Church History at the University of Erlangen to teach here at Emmanuel Seminary in far-off Adelaide. This isn't the place to retell the well-known story of the remarkable contribution to Lutheranism worldwide by Sasser, or of his last difficult years at Erlangen. He basically had to leave. Here I merely recall memories of the great man from personal experience as a student at his feet and later as a very junior colleague. Those who heard Sasser lecture, and there are many here in this hall, those who heard Sasser lecture will remember that he always came into the classroom with a pile of books under his arm. I have no recollection of him ever opening one book during a class. Can any of you tell me whether you remember him opening a book. No one has raised them. He needn't have brought them in. We knew he'd read them all anyway. I think they were just academic props. I also remember that he was not easily hoodwinked. A student prankster once hid under the desk at which Zasse happened to be lecturing over in classroom 1 and moved the desk slightly from time to time, left, so that Zasse had to shift his chair left and then shifted the desk further this way. It was the kind of desk which was enclosed, so you couldn't see from the front who was there. Zasse was quite unfazed, just kept shifting his chair to keep up with the desk. At the end of the lecture, he stood up and said, "You can come out now, Mr. Oberscheid." My own worst moment with Zasse was just before my final year church history exam, and I blush to tell you this story. I'll try to blush. I was running late and suffering a major emergency. I don't have to explain. The person occupying the men's toilet off the courtyard in that corner was taking an interminable amount of time to finish his business. Becoming increasingly desperate and irate, I was reduced to offering some very unflattering comments and suggestions about what the occupant might do. Eventually, I stood on a chair and peered over the top of the door at the occupant below. Dr. Zasse looked up and simply said, "Just a minute, please, Mr. Pfitzner, just a minute, please." He always addressed students as Mr. The crisis was over. I sat for the exam and gained a distinction. Sola gratia, by grace alone. Seriously, it could not have been easy for Drs. Habart and Zasse to work together. After all, the one-time Erlangen professor and teacher now had to work under his previous student. If there were moments of tension, they were kept from public view most of the time. However, the atmosphere became very strained at one faculty meeting when the discussion turned to library management. Zasse turned on Doc and vehemently accused Mrs. Habart as cataloguer of messing up meine Weimaraner, my Weimaraner, the standard edition of Luther's works. The German words he employed were insulting, affronting. Most of us who witnessed the outburst expressed sympathy to Doc, whose initial reaction was to resign as principal. Whether Zasse ever offered his apologies, I do not know. The point I'm making is that all great men are very human. Some of us are very human without the greatness. This episode makes all the more remarkable the genuine tribute Dr. Habart paid to Zasse on his sudden death in August 1976, aged 81, same year, same age as Habart. By the way, he probably died from asphyxiation when a heater set fire to his little cottage that once stood on Wellington Square, where married student apartments now stand. Habart's moving tribute includes the following lines, and I read them. Zasse's death took from us one of the last generation of the grand old men in the church. His passing was noted throughout the Christian world, an eloquent tribute to his many connections, meticulously nurtured by a vast correspondence that kept him in touch with every continent, every denomination, with men and women everywhere, whose passion, like his, was the Church of Jesus Christ, the Word, the sacraments, the truth. This passion for truth often led him to speak harsh words, to pronounce solemn anathemas against those who compromised the truth. His great bequest to us is the realization that we need the backward look to our origins if we would know who we are, and having discovered them, to proceed with courage to the tasks of the future in loyalty to the heritage and the tradition of the past and to the truth of God's word, conscious of the fact that the church has nothing to fear if it will not deny him who is its Lord, Jesus Christ, crucified and risen. A personal note, my last memory of Zasse is of sitting in his cottage a few nights before he died, I think 2 nights, and sharing with him a bottle of red. He loved red wine. He had invited me over to talk about New Testament studies, which, as a student of the famous Adolf Deismann in Berlin, had been his first love. He again asked for my reaction to his famous article, which is article number 1 in volume 1 of the famous prestigious German journal for New Testament studies, ZNW, Zeitschrift für Neutestamentliche Wissenschaft, in which he argued that the Johannine farewell discourses are a composite work and the promised Paraclete, the Comforter, was originally the evangelist himself. That I again disagreed, not with the first thesis, it's obvious, but with the second thesis. That didn't bother him at all. It was the exchange of ideas that counted. Not long ago, I got out my student notes taken in Zassa's classes in Church History 1 and 2 and in History of Dogma. My recollection was that he often digressed to expand on, quote, the greatest tragedy of church history. There were many greatest tragedies of church history. It's the way he talked. Older students could recall his early struggles with English. He once talked about the great slaughter of the Aborigines. Slaughter of the Aborigines, slaughter of the Aborigines. What I discovered on rereading my notes was that his courses were well structured, full of detail, comprehensive, and theologically insightful. He was no mere chronicler, but had an amazing ability to grasp the enduring significance of broad sweeps of history. I have placed my springback binders of class notes in the Lutheran archives as a personal memorial to Dr. Zassa. It is mystifying that his portrait is nowhere to be found on the walls of Australian Lutheran College, where he taught for many years. The present principal has agreed to do something about that at my suggestion. How can one possibly give an adequate literary portrait of Paul David Parle, otherwise known variously as Dave, Brick or Murray, the latter two derived from Murray Bricker, Murray Bridge, born, Brig from an early posting in Brigalow, Queensland, or Cooper P.D. Parle, obvious, isn't it? He steadfastly maintained that the family name was correctly pronounced Parle, but extensive researches in Germany on my part and on the part of others have failed to back up that assertion. I think he was wrong. He was a jocular, rambunctious, stentorian man about whom legends abound. He abhorred pretentiousness and cant. I believe he was a sportsman in younger years. He was certainly hale and hearty during his lecturing years here. His physical strength came in handy back when it was still legal to use a sweep net on fishing expeditions to York Peninsula, where catches were good as long as physical warmth was maintained with a flagon of port. Dave took his turn with me, dragging the deep end of the net. I recall him once disappearing in a tidal hole. Went down, nowhere to be seen, presently emerging like Venus rising from the sea. Not quite the Botticelli picture, but those who will remember his rotundity will get the picture. He was in his element, sitting around a fire on the beach, spinning yarns and telling jokes. There are probably still extant more yarns about Parle than he himself ever told. It's no secret, but a fact confirmed by his wife Signa, that Parle was an incredibly powerful snorer. He and I once shared the special guest accommodation at a pastor's retreat at Coolum on the Queensland Sunshine Coast. We were the guest lecturers. Not long into the night, I took refuge in the large dormitory with dozens of other men to escape the incredible wheezing, whistling, coughing, snorting, rasping, spluttering and grunting noise that issued from my sleeping companion. That was just breathing in. He slept through it all, had a wonderful sleep, asked me calmly in the morning why I had vacated our luxury suite. Lest I give a wrong impression, Dave Parle was no theological lightweight. During his ministry in New Zealand, he armed himself With a university degree in linguistics, including ancient languages, further study enabled him to become an internationally recognized expert in medieval Latin, giving him access to important primary sources. Evidence thereof is his translation of Luther's lectures on Genesis that form the first volumes of the American edition of Luther's works, a great contribution to Luther research. Paul had an amazing ability to retain a vast array of anecdotes and minutiae from the history of the church. He was a walking encyclopedia of historical incidentals. Not all of them highly important, but always entertaining. The very least that can be said of Dr. Paul's lectures is that they were highly entertaining, as evidenced by the raucous laughter that issued from most of his classes. This happened to be quite disadvantageous for anyone lecturing in the adjoining classroom. I recall my students in classroom 2 straining to hear the jokes being told next door in classroom 1 and not paying attention to the pearls of exegetical insight that I was trying to impart. We've already noticed that Paul could strain the patience of a chairman. This voracious reader could also test the patience of librarians. No amount of appealing could make him refrain from heavily marking books with underlining, supralinear comments, large exclamation or question marks in the margins, even in biro. I meant to bring along a copy of First Century Gnosticism by G. Van Groningen. It was a bad book to start with. When Paul finished, it was a disaster area. I left it home. I meant to bring it. I forgot. It was impossible not to like this bluff colleague, David Parr. He was equally popular with those he worked with at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, when on sabbatical leave. I remember going to the States first time to teach over there, and everyone asked me, a lot of people asked me, "You know Paul?" Everyone knew him. He was no mean theologian. He certainly loved Luther. Sometimes it sounded as if they were personal friends. And he loved the Lutheran Church with a passion. He retired in 1981. His death over a decade later marked the end of the era of the old Concordians. Pastor A.J. Lowe, Adolf J. Lowe, was one of the original 7 teachers of Luther Seminary in 1968, but his career was cruelly cut short over a year and a half later by a brain tumour that brought about his death in June '69. He had served as a lecturer in pastoral theology at Emmanuel for 13 years after 20 years of faithful parish ministry. But he had no formal postgraduate theological training, apart from an LWF scholarship, which allowed him to take study leave in USA and Europe in '63, '64. Some older pastors will remember AJ's fervent piety, a genuine piety, and his devotion to the work of American pastoral theologian Michael Roy. If you knew Roy, preferably word for word, you could pass AJ's exams with one leg in the air. I'm not sure whether that's a theological stance, but you know what I mean. At Union, Dr. Elvin W. Janetsky was called to be principal of the new Lutheran Teachers College. Pastor Lowe's death led to Jan, as he was called by colleagues and students, or Tom, to serve as pastoral theologian at Luther from 1970. He deserves to be remembered as a foundational member of the seminary teaching staff. He had been forced to give up studies in law to serve in PNG during the Second World War. He steadfastly refused to talk about his wartime experience, even to members of his family, so there must have been harrowing experiences. After ordination, he served on the staff of Concordia College Toowoomba and then gained his doctorate at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. Among his special areas of expertise were Christian education and the Lutheran confessions. In actual fact, I think Jan was more at home in systematic theology than he was in pastoral theology. my personal opinion. In later years, I got to know Jan especially well as his vice principal, inheriting from him the office of academic dean. A look at the academic files when I moved into the office revealed the essence of the man. He was a precisionist in the fullest sense of the word, everything extremely methodical, orderly, tidy. And that's how he played golf. Straight down the middle, neat around the greens, not like myself who got my money's worth, walked the long way around the course, spending a considerable amount of time in the shrubbery. Those were the good old days when Jan, John Koch and I would head up to Mount Osmond course late on some Friday, summer afternoons on Friday, and solve most of the problems of the church and the world at the 19th. Jan was a private man. Most of his colleagues didn't know until his wife died that she had terminal cancer. I, for one, did not see that his mental powers were fading by the end of his short 3-year term as principal in 1988, and so I was very surprised to be asked to take over from him as principal. His death in 2004 at the age of 83 after years of dementia, very difficult for his family, came as a relief to them. 5 other pioneers from the first decade of Luther Seminary are still alive, so I have to be a bit careful what I say here. Numero uno, Dr. J.T. Renner, the elder statesman of the LCA for over 6 decades, and another decade, hopefully. He was my college chaplain. He introduced me to the joys of New Testament Greek. He became my teacher in Old Testament after he returned from doctoral studies in Heidelberg, and then he became my colleague. He remains my respected friend, the teacher and friend of many. In talking about him now, aged 94, we are covering a large slab of Australian Lutheran history. He's an ecclesiastical treasure, a walking archive, a living link with the past. Sorry, Eric, if that makes you sound like a dinosaur. I know that the Christian Church is the bride of Christ, but Eric Renner is certainly married to the Lutheran Church of Australia. A quarter of a century has passed since he retired from full-time lecturing, but I know of many much younger pastors who are a lot more retired than he is. He still preaches in German, certainly still visits the sick, still contributes to exegetical discussions at our monthly Adelaide Pastors Returnal, contributes to Lutheran Archives, to coffee and conversation of the teaching staff here. He still reads widely, still keeps in contact with the church and theology from around the world, still prowls his beloved North Adelaide precincts. And to an inquiry about his well-being, he is still likely to respond in German with immer noch auf 2 Beinen, still going on 2 legs. A much-loved colleague, Eric Renner made the Old Testament come alive for students and for pastors at in-service schools. He was never dogmatic about source theories, questions of authorship, but he didn't shy away from exposing students to critical literary questions raised by the texts themselves. More importantly, he could locate the charismatic heart of the Old Covenant. He could find the gospel in the Old Testament without flying immediately to forced Christological interpretations. That this gentle churchman was sometimes viewed as a dangerous liberal was and is a source of wonderment. One could say much about Eric Renner as a pastor, theologian, committee man, an ecumenist who served for many years on the Catholic-Lutheran dialogue. This will have to suffice, with the addition of what I wrote in tribute to him on his retirement in 1991. And again, offer my apologies, dear brother. In one field, Renner remains supreme. Who can match his ability to speak and write in 5 languages at once? He even created a unique Rennerian diction which has become part of seminary folklore. For example, The pensum of the theological enterprise is to scarify the gravamina, and where issues tend to be rubberoid, to engage in some salient grasshopperizing before referring the matter to another gremium. I made the sentence up, but they were some terms that he liked to use. The second man, whom the UELCA sent overseas as part of a deliberate policy of training men for seminary lectureships, was sent over there because of his good looks. Sorry, Morris. Dr. Morris Edmund Schilt, also a graduate of Heidelberg. We were fellow students at Emmanuel College and one time fellow delinquents off campus with girls. We were together at Adelaide University and Emmanuel Seminary. Ed, as we called him in younger years, from Edmund, his second name, completed much of his undergraduate as well as doctoral studies at Heidelberg, which accounts for his mastery of the German language and his fluency as a preacher in that tongue. In 1970, Morris was called from parish ministry at Doncaster in Melbourne to replace the retired Zusser. An immediate student reaction was, quote, "He lectures with personal conviction." And that's how he preaches. As a teacher, researcher, writer, he contributed to a fuller grasp of Luther's life and thinking in developmental perspective. This as a result of familiarity with the sources. It is that direct involvement with primary texts that helped him make not only Luther more accessible to students and pastors, but also other figures like Bugenhagen and Bonhoeffer, the latter remaining a special interest and area of expertise. The person of Morris Schilt, who retired at the end of 2000, brings to my mind three things apart from personal friendship. The first is his passionate preaching. Historians can get lost in the past, not this brother. He not only chewed the word, that's Luther's expression, to digest its meanings, but let it speak to real issues that God's sometimes struggling saints face. No room for pious platitudes with this man. Secondly, there is his acute social conscience and keen perception of justice issues. The politics of passion, whether the plight of refugees, of Indigenous Australians, of the yet unborn, or others unable to speak up for themselves, is to the fore in his thinking, speech, and action. Thirdly, there is his contribution to ecumenical dialogue, especially with Australian Roman Catholics. Moreover, he always seems to be in touch with major developments around the world. If the seats are becoming hard, faint not nor fear, we are coming to the end. I must briefly mention a few others. I briefly mentioned Pastor Clarence Prebino. He was a year ahead of me in the classics department at university. And he eventually moved from parish ministry to serve as chaplain at Concordia, Toowoomba, and it was from there that he was called to teach Hebrew, Greek, and Latin here at Luther, beginning in 1970. In those years here, he even acquired a wife. He gained expertise in patristic studying at Cambridge at the request of the Seminary Council. Prebe, or Clary as he was known, was already in pre-Union days a very committed conservative in theology and church relations. He was known to walk out of chapel if a woman so much as read one of the lessons. I recall our principal, Henry HAMANN, censuring him at a faculty meeting for divulging confidential faculty discussions to outsiders. I'm told that Clary rated his fellow lecturers on a scale of theological orthodoxy I fear some of us, including myself, did not fare too well. As principal, I was not surprised when he resigned in 1990, I hope not because of me. He said it was to take up parish ministry in Queensland, but he eventually founded his own little synod and seminary. And yet we missed his excellent teaching of languages and church history. Finally, we come to the last lecturer added to the teaching staff in the first decade, Dr. John B. Koch, JB. He had already served for 7 years on the staff of Lutheran Teachers College before joining the Faculty of Luther in 1977. He gained his doctorate from St. Louis, so he strengthened the connections between Lutheranism in Australia and the USA, between the Murray and the Mississippi, to borrow the title of his book. His areas of expertise extended to most areas of pastoral theology and Christian education, quite apart from archival skills and Australian church history. John's meticulous and calm style of administering his previous portfolios led him to being asked to serve as principal when I resigned from that position. He worked, taught, and preached as he played golf. I've always thought you can tell what a person is, how they play football or cricket or golf. Straight down the middle, no attempt at the adventurous or the spectacular, but precise and efficient. And I think it's totally appropriate that we recognise John Koch, who retired in 2000 as one of the foundational and pioneering lecturers at Luther Seminary and a principal. I need say a little more about myself. I've talked already about that. Just to mention that after university, my intention was to become a missionary in PNG. Instead, the church sent me overseas. The beginning of this venture in 1961 was not very auspicious. I just tell you one anecdote. I'd been in town for a couple of weeks and got an urgent message from my professor, who said, "I hear you're in town, where are you? Why don't you come and see me?" I arrived on his doorstep, only to be given a quick lesson on correct etiquette. Rengstorff was a very imposing, tall, good-looking gentleman. On the first visit, I took a bunch of flowers and was quickly told, "You only take 3 at first visit." I took 1 bottle of wine, you take 2, and the host can. That's the old German etiquette. I don't think it's in play any longer, I don't know. We discussed the New Testament. He gave me an exam and then told me to go home and read the New Testament. Not quite as blunt as that, but I didn't exactly star in his examination of Bibelkunde, knowledge of the New Testament. God uses all sorts and conditions of men to cite the old general prayer, all sorts of people to serve God's purposes. I look forward to the day when women are fully accepted as lecturers in theology as they are in overseas seminary in which I have worked since retirement. Despite the dominating maleness of past times, I look back on the early years of Luther Seminary as the best of times. Some factors made life easier back then. We actually had a program of sabbatical leave, believe it or not. Time off for further study every 7 years, usually overseas. We were not loaded with checks and reviews that began increasingly imposed upon us after we gained external accreditation for degree programs, beginning with the BTH in 1987. We could run this place with 1 administrative staff member. 1 lady. There were negatives. I did not enjoy the often tense debates in meetings of the Commission on Theology and Interchurch Relations, which all faculty members could attend and many of us had to write for. Nor was I alone in deeming the theological agenda of the church in those days to be extremely limited. Lecturers spent a great deal of time writing papers and formulating resolutions from the church on the interpretation of Genesis, on scripture, on church relations. Ironically, the faculty was often under suspicion of being too liberal in those days. The exact opposite of recent years when the teaching staff has been seen as including too many ultra-conservatives. My own moment of confrontation with the heresy hunter came when a district president charged me with disrespect for the sacred scriptures. In class, I had called the patriarch Jacob a cheat, a slippery Sam, I think was the exact term I used, and King David an adulterer and a murderer. I readily pleaded guilty and was stoutly defended by my principal, Henry HAMANN. I've simplified the whole issue, but there were a couple of other cases when, I had a dead snake dropped outside my window by one student, and I We were able to find out very quickly who the student was, because the snake is not indigenous to this part of the world, comes from a certain part of Australia, which just happened to be where this student came from. That they were the best of times is a perspective probably gained as so often with advancing years. But the older men like Hebert, HAMANN, Zasser, Pahl, Renner now seem to be the great characters, people with more Profil, as you'd say in German, than us young retirees who are still in our late 70s and 80s. But it's enough that the Lord has graciously deigned to use us all. Every frail teacher will eventually be taught perfectly in glory, when we will know even as we now are known. All who have taught at Luther Seminary and those who still do at ALC will agree that it's a wonderful privilege to prepare people for ministry. And we who have taught to prepare people for pastoral ministry have had a joy that pastors in the field don't have: an annual harvest of frisch gebackene Pastoren, freshly baked pastors. It's inappropriate for an emeritus to suggest where the ALC should head in the future. Might I humbly make one suggestion: that the college consciously should seek to teach theology to a wider clientele, to serve all churches, to be more deliberately ecumenical in focus. A small denominational school like this one in Australia has very limited prospects of survival in the long run, I believe. Our continuous use of the tag Lutheran suggests a minority complex at a time when we should be seeking a majority focus. I wish the school would have been called St. John's or something like that, not, again, Lutheran. Just my opinion. That doesn't mean the surrender of Lutheran confessional positions. Conservative confessional theology means more than talking to ourselves. If our theology and our expertise in teaching that theology are as excellent as we think they are, they need to reach out beyond the narrow denominational borders that we are presently confined in. I think the administrative framework for accomplishing this goal, for example, partnership with the Roman Catholics, for example, is already given with membership in the Australian College of Divinity. I thank you for your patience, and I'm prepared to listen to your memories. Thank you.
What a tough task. It's always easy to tackle things, but to take on a task of talking about people, especially ones that are living, and not upset people is quite a challenge. But I think you'll all agree that Vic has come through with flying colours tonight. Some of the words that you used: admiration, respect, affection, for your colleagues. I'm sure the people in this audience tonight would use those same words about you and your impact on the Lutheran Church in Australia. We thank you for that. I'd throw in a couple more words that come to mind having listened to tonight's presentation. One is humility. To refer to your own important career in those words shows the humility that you have in your person, so thank you for that. The other one is courage. To speak the truth and make suggestions, I think that says a lot as well. So without further ado, we have a couple of gifts here as thanks for your work, a little honorarium, and a little drop of red, The Pastor's Son by Peter Lehman, probably suitable, I would say, for a person like yourself. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And also on behalf of Australian Lutheran College, I'd like to thank you, Vic, and thank you for your presentation tonight, and for those not so subtle little challenges that you threw out for us to hear. They were heard. In concluding this evening, I would like to thank you all for your attendance. Those inside of this room and those who are able to join us from the comfort of their own homes. It was good to be able to come together for this.